Nobody on board the USS Halberd could understand why the main propulsion system had failed just hours before deployment. World-class engineers, naval technicians, and contracted specialists tore the engine room apart, recalibrated every component, and still, the giant beast refused to wake. That's when the commanding general made a controversial decision. He called in a man long forgotten by the ranks, a retired Navy veteran with more rust on his boots than medals on his chest. What followed wasn't just a repair job. It was a lesson in humility, history, and the kind of brilliance that doesn't show up on paper. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm had rolled in with a rumble that shook the steel bones of the harbor, and yet it wasn't the weather that had the officers scrambling, it was the silence of the ship's heart. The USS Halberd, an aging yet formidable aircraft carrier scheduled for high-visibility operations in the Pacific, had gone eerily quiet. Its massive nuclear propulsion engine, which had carried it across oceans for over 2 decades, now sat dormant. The crew had been preparing for months, aligning mission protocols, ensuring every system ticked like clockwork. But in the early hours of that fateful morning, the unexpected failure left a void of certainty, and tension began creeping like fog across the decks. Captain Felix Mendez, a decorated officer known for his calm under fire, stood at the edge of the engine room catwalk, staring down into a space that had always pulsed with heat and power. Now it looked more like a forgotten cathedral, steel pipes forming arches, digital panels dark, warning lights blinking in quiet mockery. Around him, engineers in jumpsuits spoke in hushed tones, flipping through diagnostic reports, running and rerunning protocols with no progress. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. This wasn't just mechanical. It was symbolic. This ship had always moved. It had been the backbone of multiple operations, and now, on the eve of one of its most critical deployments, it had simply stopped. Naval protocol dictated a strict hierarchy of response in technical emergencies. First came the internal team, the ship's own elite engineers. When they failed, regional base command sent in their best from across the Atlantic Fleet. When they failed, the Pentagon approved private defense contractors, people who charged by the second and had resumes that stretched longer than sea charts. But each of them came, stared at the wiring like it spoke an alien language, and left with furrowed brows and unsatisfying theories. Maybe it was a software corruption, maybe thermal fatigue, maybe microfractures in the containment seals. Maybe. No one had answers, only guesses. General Mason Caldwell wasn't a man who liked guesswork. Having served in multiple high-stakes arenas over the last 35 years, from tactical command to foreign advisory roles, he had developed a reputation for unconventional decisions that often paid off. Still, when he made the call to bring in someone outside the current naval system, eyebrows rose so high you could practically hear the unspoken criticisms bouncing around the command tower. But Mason didn't flinch. He reached into an old notebook he kept in his desk drawer, one filled with scribbles, sketches, and names from a different era, and he dialed a number that hadn't been used in nearly a decade. The man he called was Thomas Beckett. Few among the younger ranks had ever heard the name, and those who had knew only fragments, rumors of a maverick engineer who had once reversed a catastrophic system overload mid-mission by rerouting power using an outdated analog interface. A man who, after a string of disciplinary skirmishes with bureaucratic command, had requested early retirement and disappeared into obscurity. He wasn't on anyone's active duty list. He wasn't in the Pentagon contractor files. He wasn't even in the Naval Engineering database anymore, having been manually removed during a purge of retired records. And yet, in the halting silence of that crippled engine room, General Caldwell's decision would soon become the only one that mattered. Beckett arrived not with fanfare, but with a battered duffel bag, steel-toed boots, and a face that looked like it had been carved from an old naval bulkhead. The years had not been kind in the traditional sense. His beard was uneven, his back slightly hunched, but his eyes were sharp as flares. He didn't walk in like a savior. He walked in like someone who knew machines better than people, someone who had once lived in the bowels of ships and still dreamed in the language of engine rhythms. Most of the engineering crew stared in disbelief as he stepped onto the deck. Whispers circled. Who is he? Why is he here? Isn't he retired? But Beckett didn't respond to the murmurs. He moved straight to the engine room, paused at the doorway, and took a long breath. Something shifted in him as he crossed that threshold, like an old lion returning to the savannah. His hand reached out, not for a manual or a digital tablet, but for the wall itself, fingers grazing the cold metal as if greeting an old friend. While others brought algorithms and data maps, Beckett brought something different: memory, instinct, the intimate kind of understanding that can only come from years of living within the belly of a machine, listening to its secrets, recognizing its aches and quirks the way a parent knows a child's cry in the night. No one said it, but everyone felt it. Something had changed the moment he stepped aboard. The silence that had haunted the ship felt less heavy, like the halberd itself was waiting, watching, and maybe even hoping. Long before the call came, Thomas Beckett had settled into a rhythm that could only be described as mechanical in its own right. Quiet mornings starting with the screech of an old kettle on a dented stovetop. Afternoons spent tinkering with farm equipment no one else in the county could fix. And long evenings sitting on a rust-covered porch swing that creaked with every shift of his weathered weight. His home, an old ranch house tucked away in the Appalachian foothills of North Carolina, stood like a forgotten relic, half repair shop, half mausoleum for parts and memories. There was a smell of oil embedded in the wood of the floors, and the low hum of a ceiling fan accompanied every hour of the day like an unspoken companion. For someone who had once danced with machines at the edge of disaster on the world's most powerful ships, life had become remarkably still. The townsfolk knew him as the fix-it man, the kind of person you called when your generator coughed its last breath or when your irrigation pump sputtered out after the last frost. He spoke little, charged less, and often refused payment entirely if the job involved anything older than 10 years. The locals admired him in the way one admires a mountain, respected, distant, unmoving. They didn't know much about his past. Some guessed he'd worked on submarines. Others thought he might have been a professor who got burned out and ran away from the world. Only a few older veterans at the American Legion knew pieces of the truth, and even they spoke of Beckett with a strange reverence, like whispering his name too loudly might summon storms. His hands were his most telling feature. Thick-fingered, calloused, and forever stained beneath the fingernails, they moved with the kind of care that couldn't be taught. When he wasn't repairing something, he was building something else. Small windmills made from scrap metal, wooden boxes with intricate latch systems, an entire grandfather clock that ticked with unmatched precision. He didn't do it for money or for company. He did it because the silence of the hills was too complete otherwise. Because motion, even in small things, reminded him he was still alive. But the truth was, Beckett had never fully left the Navy. He might have turned in his uniform and badge, packed away the plaques and commendations, and walked off the dock one final time with nothing but his duffel bag and a bad knee. But the Navy had embedded itself into the architecture of his soul. Every creak of his porch reminded him of ship bulkheads. The smell of the rain on hot metal reminded him of deck drills. Even the sound of his old dog's breathing at night carried the same cadence as the auxiliary systems he once monitored in the dead hours of long voyages. He hadn't been proud of how he left. His exit had been more like an exhale than a celebration. Years of friction with bureaucratic command, his refusal to follow protocol when it clashed with logic, and a deep-rooted disdain for the newer digital systems that treated ships like disposable gadgets rather than living machines. All of it culminated in what they politely called an early retirement. In truth, he had walked away before they could strip him of the dignity he had left. The Navy hadn't fired him. They had simply stopped understanding him. And that, for Beckett, was far worse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So when the phone rang that morning, A landline that rarely buzzed unless it was spam or the local hardware store reminding him of a shipment. It took him a long moment to even register what the sound was. He moved slowly toward it, wiping grease off his palms with an old shop rag, and answered with the same gruffness he used for everything else in life. But when the voice on the other end identified itself not as a neighbor or solicitor, but as General Mason Caldwell, Beckett's spine straightened. He didn't salute. That muscle had atrophied long ago. But his silence said everything. He listened as Caldwell explained the situation. The USS Halberd, engine failure, no solution. Deployment at risk. And finally, the request. Would he come? Beckett didn't say yes immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it meant. Ships were not machines to him. They were beings. A carrier was a city with a soul. And when its heart went quiet, it wasn't just a technical error. It was a call for help. He stared out the window at the hills, rolling like waves into the distance, and whispered a quiet promise to himself that if he was going to answer this call, it wouldn't be to prove anything to anyone. It would be for the ship. Packing was an easy ritual. The same canvas duffel from his last deployment, filled with essentials. A pair of worn coveralls, a flashlight older than most lieutenants, a coil of copper wire, 2 screwdrivers with handles carved to fit only his grip, and a compact analog meter he trusted more than any tablet. He didn't need a manual. He didn't need a blueprint. What he needed was time, and a chance to listen to the ship before anyone else tried to drown her out again. The ride to the base was quiet, save for the rhythmic clatter of train wheels. No security escort, no official welcome. Just a clearance badge waiting at the dock, and a young ensign who couldn't hide the surprise in his eyes when he realized who the Navy had dragged out of retirement. Beckett didn't engage. He simply nodded, stepped onto the dock with the precision of a man returning to sacred ground, and boarded the USS Halberd with no ceremony, no fanfare. Only a purpose. And that was all he ever needed. The USS Halberd was more than just a warship. It was a floating city, a mobile fortress, a mechanical leviathan capable of projecting power and presence anywhere across the 7 seas. From a distance, she looked eternal, her towering superstructure bristling with radar dishes and antennas, her vast runway decks stretching like land carved from steel. But up close, where the steel met sweat and sound, the truth was far more complex. Beneath her armor, she groaned with age. She creaked with the burden of decades of duty. And though painted, polished, and praised in press releases, those who served aboard her knew this ship had stories in her bones. The air on the carrier was thick with mechanical breath, diesel fumes, hydraulic oil, and the tang of salt embedded into every exposed seam. The corridors were narrow, more labyrinth than hallway, lined with exposed pipes and flickering lights that had once gleamed but now pulsed with fatigue. Rust didn't show itself in overt rebellion. It whispered through the rivets and seams, hiding in corners where brine found the smallest wound to exploit. The floors, scuffed and dented by generations of boots, bore the memory of every mission the ship had endured. The walls trembled faintly, not from movement, but from the life that once thrummed through them, now reduced to a low, anxious stillness. At full strength, the Halberd carried over 5,000 personnel, pilots, technicians, engineers, cooks, medics, and Marines, all coexisting in a structured chaos governed by protocol and pride. Now, with her engine dead, and deployment delayed indefinitely, that massive organism was operating on strained breath. Routines had not stopped, but they had slowed. A strange quiet blanketed the ship, especially below deck. It wasn't a silence of rest, but of tension, like a sleeping giant with one eye cracked open, waiting. The engine room, normally a furnace of coordinated chaos, now resembled a surgical theater post-disaster. Panels were pried open, circuit boards pulled and tagged, and diagnostic wires ran like tangled veins across the deck. Dozens of specialists had come and gone, leaving behind only data charts, conflicting theories, and the acrid taste of failure. At the center of it all sat the ship's twin nuclear reactors, silent titans, cold and unimpressed. Without them, the rest of the ship was powerless. Systems ran on emergency generators. Flight operations were grounded, elevators moved sluggishly, and morale, already fragile from long months of readiness drills, had begun to erode like paint on salt-washed steel. Everywhere Beckett walked, eyes followed. The mess halls buzzed not with conversation but with speculation. Who was the old man with the oil-stained bag and the eyes that didn't blink? Why was command putting its last hopes on someone who looked more like a welder than a savior? Even the junior officers, who normally barked orders with manufactured confidence, fell strangely quiet in his presence. He didn't dress like them, didn't walk like them, didn't care for the dance of rank and file. He moved like a man who belonged in the ship's lower belly, not in its polished briefing rooms. Beckett spent his first hours below deck, retracing steps others had already taken, but not through reports or sensors. He used his hands, his ears, and his intuition. He pressed his palm to cold pipes, he tapped bulkheads and listened to the vibrations. He ran his fingertips along the edge of a thermal valve and noted the condensation buildup. Where others saw machine failure, Beckett saw language. Every squeak, hiss, and rattle was a word, every anomaly a sentence. The ship wasn't dead, he realized. It was drowning under the noise of too many voices that didn't understand her. Above him, on the operations deck, General Caldwell remained under pressure. The Pentagon was growing impatient. Naval Command had already prepared contingency plans, and whispers of political fallout circulated like wind through a cracked hatch. The halberd's failure wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. A projection of American naval strength was now a beached myth, and rival powers were taking note. Caldwell didn't share his gamble openly. He didn't need to. He simply told his officers to clear space for Beckett and grant him unrestricted access to the ship's mechanical core. The culture aboard the halberd, like all carriers, was a blend of rigid hierarchy and raw improvisation. Enlisted sailors often bore the weight of impossible tasks, making miracles from broken parts and borrowed time. Officers navigated the dual pressures of politics and command. Somewhere between the two layers lived an unspoken language, a culture of resilience, gallows humor, and unwritten codes. Everyone knew where the real problems lay, even when reports dressed them up in jargon. And within that environment, Beckett was something both familiar and foreign. A relic, yes, but also a reminder of what the ship once was, a masterpiece of engineering guided not just by algorithms, but by intuition, sweat, and soul. The hangar bays, once alive with the screech of arrestor cables and the roar of jet engines, now stood in eerie silence. Fighter jets sat dormant beneath tarps, their outlines ghostly. The flight deck above, normally a symphony of motion and coordination, had been reduced to a long strip of silence broken only by gull cries and the occasional clang of maintenance tools. Pilots paced like caged animals. Deck crews killed time with inspections they'd already done. Everyone waited. Everyone wondered. In the officers' quarters, the younger lieutenants pored over diagnostics again and again, trying to find something Beckett might have missed or misunderstood. But what they didn't realize was this. Beckett wasn't looking for what they were. He wasn't searching for a missing line of code or a flawed capacitor. He was listening to the ship's heart, trying to hear the rhythm that had been there for 20 years. And beneath all the silence he had begun to detect a pattern, faint, inconsistent, but familiar. It was a heartbeat, faint, but not gone, and that made all the difference. For every act of brilliance born from intuition and experience, there exists an equal and opposite force. Protocol, fortified by pride. On board the USS Halberd, that force was embodied in Lieutenant Commander Rourke Danner, a man whose career was forged in the era of automation and precision analytics. Rourke represented everything the modern Navy celebrated: youth sharpened by technology, efficiency over instinct, and a fierce belief in data supremacy. With degrees from MIT and Naval Postgraduate School under his belt, and a service record that sparkled with unblemished operations and accolades from Pentagon technocrats, Danner was the Navy's golden boy. And when the engine room failed, he was the first name summoned by Central Command to oversee the diagnostics and recovery process. To his credit, Rourke approached the crisis with relentless professionalism. He deployed every tool available: thermal imaging, vibration analysis, dynamic modeling software. He brought in outside contractors, cross-referenced sensor logs, conducted simulations that processed terabytes of system feedback within hours. But for all his data and diagrams, the result was the same. The halberd's propulsion system remained frozen, silent, and defiant. Still, Danner refused to accept that the problem lay beyond his methods. If anything, the ship's silence became a personal affront. And so, when General Caldwell brought in a man from another era, an analog thinker in a digital world, Danner's reaction was not just skepticism, it was quiet fury. From the moment Beckett stepped on board, Danner watched him like a hawk. Not openly hostile at first, his bearing was too disciplined for that, but with a simmering condescension that seeped into every interaction. He referred to Beckett as the mechanic in briefings, never by name. When Beckett made his initial assessments using nothing more than his senses and a flashlight, Danner chuckled behind closed doors, citing the absurdity of relying on, quote, gut feeling inside a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. But beneath his outward dismissal lay something deeper: fear. Not fear of sabotage or failure, but fear that Beckett's success would unravel everything Danner had built his career upon. The cultural divide between them ran deeper than knowledge. It was generational, philosophical. Beckett believed in listening to the machine. Danner believed in commanding it. Where Beckett saw complexity as something to be respected, Danner treated it as something to be dominated. And as days passed and the halberd's silence remained unbroken, that divide widened into a rift that began affecting the entire technical team. Some younger engineers, initially aligned with Danner, started sneaking into the engine room during Beckett's late-night inspections, drawn not just by curiosity but by a strange sense of reverence. They saw the old man crawling into ducts no one else dared enter, examining outdated schematics with childlike focus, and somehow making progress where high-tech methods had stalled. This quiet shift didn't go unnoticed. Danner, sensing his authority threatened, doubled down. He issued memos requiring Beckett to report his findings through official channels, insisted on documented procedures, and even suggested restricting Beckett's access to certain diagnostic systems for, quote, safety reasons. But General Caldwell, though tactful, wasn't swayed. He reminded Danner that Beckett had full clearance, and that results, not rank, would determine who led the repair operation. That directive only made Danner dig in deeper. One afternoon, during a systems meeting in the operations room, tensions finally surfaced. Beckett had noted a strange harmonic frequency ripple in the primary conduit casing, something he claimed was an audible resonance detectable only at a certain pressure gradient. He described it in plain language, referencing an obscure case from 2 decades earlier involving a similar carrier in the Atlantic Fleet. Danner interrupted, calling the theory unverifiable and lacking empirical support, dismissing it in front of a room full of engineers. Beckett didn't argue. He simply stood, dropped a handwritten diagram on the table, and walked out. The room stayed silent for a long time after he left. From that point on, Danner's efforts weren't just about solving the engine failure. They became a mission to prove Beckett wrong. He launched a secondary task force to replicate Beckett's findings using controlled simulations. He combed through the carrier's sensor logs frame by frame, looking for data that could invalidate Beckett's claims. He even contacted naval archivists to verify the legitimacy of Beckett's old case study. But while he chased disproof, Beckett continued to work quietly, piece by piece, treating the halberd not as a problem to be solved but as a patient to be healed. The conflict began spilling into the crew quarters. Junior engineers started whispering their frustrations. Rumors swirled about Danner's obsession, about Beckett's midnight visits to the reactor chamber, about old protocols being resurrected from storage lockers long sealed. There were reports that Beckett had isolated a forgotten backup system designed decades ago, a system most believed decommissioned, one that might hold the key to rebooting the main propulsion loop. But accessing it would mean bypassing Danner's authority and going against current naval protocol. It would require risk. And for Danner, who valued control above all else, that was unacceptable. His frustration turned into subtle sabotage, orders delayed, resources misplaced, time-sensitive authorizations mysteriously revoked, just long enough to stall Beckett's progress. Nothing that could be traced directly, but just enough to send a message. This is my ship, and I don't share the wheel. And all the while the halberd remained adrift, waiting not for data or systems approval, but for someone who truly understood what made her run. Beckett, meanwhile, didn't react with anger. He'd seen this kind of resistance before. He knew the fear that drove men like Danner, the terror that someone outside the system could render the system obsolete. He didn't need to win an argument. He just needed to hear the next clue in the halberd's long silence. And as he ran his hand along the insulated wiring behind bulkhead C7, he felt it again, that faint pulse. The one no computer had picked up. A signature vibration, out of sync but persistent, like a whisper that had waited years to be heard. And this time, he knew exactly where to follow it. The next morning came faster than anyone anticipated. A low-hanging mist curled over the dockyard like an omen, shrouding the USS Grant in pale uncertainty. Lieutenant Felix Thatcher stood at the edge of the main pier with his arms crossed, staring into the distance where the aircraft carrier's massive frame barely pierced the fog. Behind him, engineers and crew were assembling under the temporary command post, their chatter muted by fatigue and quiet frustration. Commander Roy Hill, a man who usually greeted each day with punctual strides and sharp confidence, moved more slowly now, reviewing status reports that all told the same story. Nothing had changed. The heart of the ship, its propulsion system, remained cold and silent. After weeks of specialists combing through every inch of machinery, software, and diagnostics, the verdict remained agonizingly unclear. Some whispered that maybe the entire drive system had been compromised. Others feared a deeper flaw, something rooted in the aging infrastructure that no one dared fully admit. But no one had a solution. And the longer the USS Grant stayed docked, the worse the political pressure became. The Pentagon had invested over $2 billion into its upgrades. War games were scheduled in less than a month. Allies were already questioning U.S. naval readiness. And in the shadows of every whispered conversation loomed the growing fear that this modern marvel might never leave the bay again. Yet, as the fog thinned just past 7:30, all attention shifted. A lone black SUV rolled slowly down the dock road, escorted by 2 uniformed Marines. Its arrival hadn't been announced on the morning roster, but word traveled fast. That must be him, the veteran, the general's pick. Whispers rippled across the engineers like wind through dry leaves. Most of them had scoffed at the news the night before, calling it a Hail Mary move, rooted more in desperation than strategy. Some muttered about how ridiculous it was to bring in a retiree, a man who'd likely been out of service longer than some of the junior engineers had been alive. But as the door opened and he stepped out, their casual criticisms caught in their throats. There stood Wallace Walt McCann, 71 years old, tall as a mast, and with a bearing that hadn't diminished 1 inch with age. His hair had gone entirely silver, but his steps carried no hesitation, no stiffness. He wore a plain blue windbreaker over an old Navy-issued thermal, tan cargo pants, and thick-soled boots that clunked solidly against the metal gangplank as he walked. No greetings, no hesitation, just a brief nod to the escorting officer and a leather duffel thrown over one shoulder. General Kirkland met him at the ramp, and the two exchanged a quiet handshake. The general didn't smile, but there was a weight in the way he clapped Walt on the shoulder, something personal and heavy with history. Commander Hill approached cautiously, extending a hand while eyeing the newcomer. He expected the typical pleasantries. What he got instead was a brief, firm grip and a curt nod before Walt turned and looked toward the ship. "Take me to the engine room," was all he said, and it was less of a request than an order. The engineers followed, silent and skeptical, as if watching a ghost walk among the living. It wasn't just his age that unsettled them, it was the way he moved, as though the USS Grant was not unfamiliar terrain, but a place he had memorized once and had returned to claim. Below deck, the temperature dropped as the group descended into the mechanical bowels of the ship. The lighting was dimmer here, humming with fluorescent flickers. The engine chamber was vast, a cathedral of steel and circuitry, but its silence was almost sacrilegious. Generators, turbines, fuel cells, all intact, all dead. As the team gathered around the perimeter, Walt walked slowly to the center of the room. He didn't touch anything, didn't speak, just stood, breathing in the scent of cold metal and oil, eyes narrowing. Some of the younger engineers exchanged amused glances, as if waiting for the punchline to an unfunny joke. But others, especially the older ones, watched with growing curiosity. He finally moved, stepping over to the main console and pulling out a folded notepad from his jacket. It was old, leather-bound and covered in fading notes, scribbled in pencil and black ink. He flipped through a few pages, nodded to himself, and then crouched beside a lower maintenance panel. "This valve. Has anyone rerouted the flow through the auxiliary bypass since the last inspection cycle?" The question came out of nowhere, sharp and pointed. A nearby technician blinked, hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir. That's not been part of any recent procedure." Walt didn't respond. He reached into his duffel, pulling out a compact flashlight, and illuminated the inside of the panel. Within moments, his gloved hand was tracing wires and switches. "Check the regulator manifold between the primary coolant distributor and the pressure modulator. If there's even a 2% drop in regulation frequency, you'll have an unstable idle loop that blocks the ignition sequence," he said without looking up. Commander Hill opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. Something in the way Walt spoke made it clear he wasn't guessing. He was remembering, and not from some manual, from experience. Over the next hour, the energy in the room shifted. Engineers who had scoffed earlier now leaned in, notebooks out, following Walt's directives. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He moved with the silent focus of someone solving a puzzle he'd seen 1,000 times in his dreams. The man didn't just understand the USS Grant, he felt it, as though the ship itself was speaking to him. Watching all of this from a corner, General Kirkland allowed himself the smallest of nods. He had taken a gamble, but it was beginning to feel like the right one. Because as crazy as it sounded, the man who'd been dismissed as an old relic was slowly resurrecting the heart of one of the Navy's most advanced warships, not with machines or algorithms, but with intuition born from a lifetime at sea. And if the hum that began to rise faintly from the back turbine was any indication, something deep inside the USS Grant was starting to wake up. Despite the disappointment simmering quietly beneath the surface of the USS Concord's operation deck, Rear Admiral Camden pushed forward with reluctant acceptance. Though none of the top engineers had delivered a breakthrough, and no one could yet decode the reason the colossal engine remained frozen in defiance, the daily routine of the Navy had to continue. Camden returned to his quarters that evening with a hardened look, the creases in his brow heavier than usual. He had to draft a temporary contingency plan for the fleet's rotation since the Concorde could no longer perform its scheduled operations. The ship, once the Navy's pride, now idled in still waters, a monument to mechanical failure and bureaucratic helplessness. Meanwhile, on the other end of the country, nestled in a quiet fishing town along the Oregon coast, Winston Briggs took his morning coffee on the porch of a small, paint-chipped house that overlooked the bay. The sea had always been his compass, and though his days in uniform were long behind him, he still rose at 5:30 every morning, as if Reveille might still echo across the deck. The house was humble, but lovingly kept, filled with relics from a past life. Medals tucked away in a cigar box, framed photographs of proud young sailors, and a faded photo of the USS Halberd, his last ship before retirement. Winston's days had settled into a comfortable rhythm. He helped fix local boats, mentored kids at the local maritime academy, and sometimes just sat and listened to the gulls. The phone rarely rang anymore, but when it did on that Wednesday morning, it startled him like a depth charge. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times before picking up. On the other end was Major General Bryant Hartwell, a man he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. There was no time for small talk. The call was brief, direct, and deeply unsettling. The USS Concord was dead in the water. The Navy had exhausted its best and brightest. Hartwell asked him, pleaded with him to come take a look. Winston didn't respond right away. He stared out at the horizon as if waiting for the waves to answer. He hadn't stepped foot on a Navy ship in over 17 years. The world had changed. Protocols evolved, and the systems they used now were generations removed from the analog monsters he used to know. But beneath that uncertainty was something else. An old fire, reluctant but undeniable. He told Hartwell he'd think about it. That night, Winston pulled out a cardboard box from under his bed. Inside were journals, his own engineering notes from over 35 years of active duty. They weren't digital, they weren't pretty, but they were meticulous. He flipped through sketches, schematics, problem logs, and long-forgotten maintenance tricks. He wasn't sure if any of it still applied, but muscle memory is a strange thing. It lives in the hands, in the spine, even when the mind grows cautious. And somewhere in the pages of a 1987 journal, beside a hand-drawn diagram of a now outdated auxiliary propulsion system, he saw a note he'd scribbled in haste. When the engine hums but the drive shaft doesn't move, it's almost never electrical. It's always pressure or balance. Winston blinked. That phrase, it tugged at something. Not a solution yet, but a direction. The next morning, he called Hartwell. "Get me a seat on the next military transport out of Portland," he said. Hartwell didn't ask questions. Within 24 hours, Winston Briggs stood at the base of the airstrip in full clearance gear, wearing his old Navy jacket and a face that was more serious than anyone had seen in years. The journey to the USS Concord was strangely emotional. As he rode in the military transport, Winston stared out the window, silently observing the landscape below. He didn't feel heroic, he felt nervous. What if he couldn't fix it? What if all the faith Hartwell had placed in him was misplaced? What if time had taken from him, not just his youth, but the edge he once wielded like a blade? But as the aircraft descended toward the floating giant of steel and pride, a deep sense of responsibility settled into his chest. When Winston stepped foot on the Concord's deck, the entire engineering crew paused. Some of them had heard whispers of who was coming, but they expected someone more modern. Instead, they saw a man with a limp, gray sideburns and a duffel bag that looked like it had seen more battles than their entire squad combined. He didn't bother with introductions or pleasantries. He simply asked to be taken below deck, straight to the engine bay. As he passed through the halls, he noticed subtle things: the temperature gradients between decks, the uneven acoustics in the pipeways, the slight metallic tang in the recycled air. None of this was in the schematics. But all of it meant something. The engine room was colder than he expected. The beast of steel sat still, its turbine blades like a frozen waterfall of potential. Winston stood before it for nearly 5 minutes in silence, listening, feeling. The room breathed differently than it should have. He crouched, placed a hand against a feed pipe, and closed his eyes. The pulse of the system was faint, but wrong. There was no tremor of tension, no rhythm of pressure balance. The engineers around him watched, puzzled. They had diagnostics. He had intuition. "Start her," he finally said. They hesitated. "Start her," he repeated, with calm authority. The room buzzed to life as the control techs flipped sequences and activated auxiliary systems. The engine coughed, rumbled, then hummed. The sound was wrong, off by a fraction. Winston tilted his head, then smiled slightly. He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew exactly where to look. When the transport helicopter finally hovered above the flight deck of the USS Lockridge and the rope ladder dropped through the rushing wind, every eye on the carrier turned skyward. The buzz of blades and shrieking air was nothing compared to the silence that fell once the ladder steadied and a single man began descending slowly, methodically, step by deliberate step. His grip was firm, legs strong, and as his boots touched the steel deck with the authority of someone returning not as a visitor, but as someone reclaiming his place, the sailors and officers around instinctively took a half-step back. Walter Braddock was no longer just a name in faded logs or an anecdote shared by old-timers at the base canteen. He was now a living legend on the deck of a vessel that had forgotten the kind of men who once made her soul burn with purpose. The commanding officers made their way to greet him, but Braddock didn't wait for introductions. He nodded at them, eyes calm, scanning the ship as if reacquainting himself with an old friend rather than assessing a piece of failing machinery. In that moment, it became clear he wasn't here to shake hands and pose for photos. He was here to do what no one else could. The first thing Braddock requested wasn't a team of engineers or a clipboard full of diagnostics. He asked for silence in the engine control room. He wanted to be alone with the heartbeat of the ship. Puzzled but compelled by his presence, Commander Ellis gave the order, and soon the humming, clicking, and clattering of technician chatter faded away, replaced only by the mechanical groans of the straining, stubborn engines. Braddock stepped into the dimly lit space and closed the hatch behind him. For almost an hour, no one heard a sound. No tapping, no voices, no orders. Just silence, interrupted only once by a deep, thunder-like rattle that echoed through the steel walls. When he emerged, his face was expressionless, but his eyes carried a fire. He asked for a meeting, not just with the engineers, but with every department head that had been involved in the repairs since day one. It was an unusual request, but no one questioned it. In that briefing room, surrounded by men and women who had dedicated their careers to knowing the intricacies of naval propulsion systems, Braddock stood without notes, without graphs, without anything but memory and instinct. He didn't lecture, he listened, he asked questions, unexpected ones, not about the power outputs or pressure tolerances, but about the sound the engines made on startup, the temperature shifts after 40 minutes of runtime, the sequence in which error lights flickered. His inquiries felt random at first, almost irrelevant, but soon, as he traced invisible patterns with his hands, a story emerged. A story no one had seen, because they were too buried in screens and software. Braddock was reading the ship like it was a living organism, and every twitch, every groan, every hiccup meant something. Slowly, disbelief began to fade from the eyes of the specialists in the room, replaced by something rarer: respect. After gathering all the pieces, Braddock finally laid out his theory. It wasn't a single-point failure. It was a cascading fault triggered by a misalignment so subtle that none of the diagnostic sensors flagged it. A minute shift in the aft turbine chamber, barely a millimeter, was setting off a chain reaction that compromised cooling flow, disrupted timing sequences, and sent the engine into protective shutdown. It was the kind of thing no AI system was trained to detect because it wasn't an error. It was a nuance. The kind of nuance only someone who had spent decades listening to engines with his hands, who knew the pitch and vibration of healthy versus strained metal, could detect. The room fell into stunned quiet, and the lead propulsion engineer, who had led the diagnostic campaign for weeks, admitted it made sense. No one had looked at the misalignment as a root cause, because it fell within tolerance ranges on paper. With newfound clarity, Braddock began outlining a revised protocol. He didn't request the fanciest tools or the most advanced systems. He asked for realignment wedges, a precision laser guide, and a team of 6 sailors who could follow exact, minute instructions. The fix wasn't going to be flashy. It was going to be slow, deliberate, and exacting. He didn't promise instant success. He promised to listen to the ship until it told him what it needed. Over the next several hours, he worked side by side with the sailors, guiding them not just with commands, but by showing them how to feel the engine's mood. When one of the younger crewmen accidentally over-tightened a bolt, Braddock didn't scold him. He calmly explained how tension traveled through the frame, and how even slight overpressure could undo their progress. He wasn't just repairing an engine, he was teaching a philosophy. By nightfall, the Lockridge had undergone more transformation in a day than it had in weeks of high-tech intervention. Braddock refused to celebrate. He simply stood back as the team prepared for the startup. No fanfare, no applause. Just Braddock's hand resting on a support beam, eyes closed, waiting for the hum. When the engine finally roared to life, smooth, confident, unbroken, it was as if the ship exhaled for the first time in weeks. The vibration was different. The usual high-pitched struggle was gone, replaced by a low, consistent thrum, like a lion stretching after a long sleep. Everyone turned to look at Braddock, but he simply nodded once and said the engine wasn't just running, it was finally home. As dawn broke over the Indian Ocean, a reddish hue spread across the sky, mirroring the quiet desperation settling into the crew aboard the USS Washington. Below deck, the engine room was a flurry of measured activity. Technicians milled about, their tools clinking against the steel floor as they moved, with the kind of alert exhaustion that comes from days without rest. Admiral Keene stood on the elevated catwalk above the main turbine, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the lifeless engine like a man staring down an adversary that refused to show its face. He wasn't an engineer, but he didn't need to be one to understand the implications. They were stranded. An aircraft carrier dead in the water was a vulnerable fortress, and with each passing hour, the margin of safety narrowed. The air inside the control room was thick with oil, heat, and tension. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the corridor. Every eye turned toward the entrance as Rear Admiral Joseph Monroe emerged, flanked by Commander Sullivan. But it was the figure walking behind them that drew the most attention, a man slightly hunched, wearing a weathered bomber jacket, face etched with age and time, and eyes that seemed to absorb everything with quiet clarity. He moved like someone who had once belonged here but hadn't been back in a long time. This was William "Iron" Maddox, retired Navy Chief Engineer. A man who hadn't set foot on an active vessel in over 2 decades. Whispers followed him like shadows. Some of the younger crew had heard the stories about the fire on the USS Lexington, the blackout off the coast of Guam, the miracle fix during the Malacca Strait operation. But to most of them, he was a name from an old manual, someone whose legend was kept alive in footnotes and sea tales. Maddox didn't acknowledge the stares. He made his way directly to the main turbine, nodding briefly at Admiral Keene, who stepped aside without a word. With a slow, practiced grace, Maddox knelt beside the diagnostic panel, laid a hand on the casing of the engine, and simply listened. It was a moment almost spiritual in its stillness. The clatter and hum of the ship seemed to recede, as if the very vessel were holding its breath. After several long seconds, Maddox exhaled deeply and stood. He didn't ask for a data report or an engineer's summary. Instead, he requested a wrench, a thermal sensor, and 5 minutes alone with the machine. Monroe raised an eyebrow but gestured for everyone to clear the room. One by one, the engineers and crew exited, throwing skeptical glances over their shoulders. Keene remained behind for a moment, searching Maddox's face for something, certainty, maybe, or sanity. But the older man offered no reassurance, only a quiet nod. When the room was empty, Maddox set to work. He moved slowly, methodically, touching pipes and tracing wires with the careful hands of a man reacquainting himself with an old friend. He opened a side panel no one else had thought to check, reached inside and paused. Then, using the wrench, He loosened a narrow valve tucked deep behind the primary coolant coil. A burst of hissing steam shot out, accompanied by the subtle groan of shifting metal. Maddox closed the panel, wiped his brow, and opened the comm channel. "Bring the crew back in," he said. Monroe, Sullivan, and the others returned, their faces tight with skepticism. Maddox turned to the lead engineer and gestured at the ignition panel. "Power it up." The engineer hesitated. "Sir, we already tried that protocol, multiple times. It overloads at 37%. Maddox's eyes narrowed. "Do it." With a reluctant sigh, the young man entered the sequence and stepped back. The room braced itself as the system hummed to life. The lights flickered. The turbine began to rotate, a low rumble building into a steady, powerful vibration. Everyone leaned in, watching the diagnostics rise. 10%, 23%, 37%. For a breathless second, the noise surged, and then, instead of failing, the system stabilized. 45%, 60%. The engine roared as it reached full operational capacity. Cheers erupted. The room exploded with disbelief and awe. Monroe stared, speechless, as data scrolled across the monitor. Perfect efficiency, optimal temperature readings, 0 anomalies. It was as if the engine had never been broken. Keene looked at Maddox, stunned. "What did you do?" Maddox gave a tired smile. There was a pressure imbalance in a misaligned secondary feed valve. The new guys rerouted a redundancy without recalibrating the older mechanics. It created a resonance loop that triggered the failsafe prematurely every time. All it needed was a small manual realignment. The explanation was simple, but the implications were staggering. Dozens of top-tier specialists, engineers with the latest tools and access to real-time analytics, had missed a detail that a retired veteran solved by touch and intuition. No manual could have taught it. No software could have detected it. Only someone who had lived and breathed this machinery for decades, someone who understood not just how it worked but how it felt, could have known. Later that evening, as the carrier resumed course and communication channels lit up with congratulations, Monroe found Maddox standing alone at the edge of the flight deck, watching the horizon. The wind whipped at his jacket, and the sea stretched out endlessly before him. Monroe joined him, silent for a moment before saying, "We owe you more than we can say." Maddox didn't look at him. "Just don't forget, that experience doesn't come with a download link. Sometimes, you need the old hands." Monroe nodded, feeling the weight of the truth. As the ship sailed forward, the legend of William Maddox took on new life. Not just as a tale of one man's brilliance, but as a reminder that in a world chasing innovation, wisdom earned in the trenches still had its place. And sometimes, it could be the difference between failure and salvation. There was a moment of uneasy quiet as Monroe stepped away from the humming behemoth of an engine, his hand trailing along the worn metal surface like it was something sacred. He didn't speak right away. The gathered engineers, Admiral Kearns, and even some skeptical mechanics stood in stiff anticipation, unsure whether Monroe's prolonged silence was a good omen, or another sign that the battle to restore the ship was spiraling further out of control. Then he turned slowly to face them, the lines in his face sharpened by shadows and sunlight filtering through the scaffolding above. His eyes didn't dart or flicker. They locked with Kearns and stayed there. He told them all to clear the bay. Everyone, even the lead engineers. There was a slight pushback, of course, mainly from the younger specialists, who didn't appreciate being asked to vacate the workspace they had all but claimed as their war room. But Monroe didn't raise his voice or justify the request. He simply stared, unmoving, until one by one the crew filtered out of the cavernous space. Only one person was allowed to stay, his son, Jeremy. It felt symbolic, like the passing of a torch, even though neither man said anything to that effect. When the last echoing footsteps faded and the door sealed shut, Monroe stood in the silence with his son. He asked Jeremy to turn off the overhead fluorescence, leaving only the natural light spilling in from the hull grates and a single lamp over the control panel. What followed next looked to anyone peering in through the narrow viewing glass more like a ritual than a repair session. Monroe opened a leather-bound notebook, frayed and faded with time, filled with handwritten annotations, sketches, and engine layouts from decades ago, schematics the Navy hadn't seen in over 30 years. These weren't the formal blueprints or digital models used by the engineers, but rather personal notes he'd taken over the years, corrections, anomalies, quirks he'd discovered through trial, error, and gut instinct. He handed the notebook to Jeremy and began what he called a deep listen. Monroe placed his hand on the engine's casing and closed his eyes. The engine was dormant, but there were still minute vibrations, tiny mechanical whispers, barely perceptible to anyone who didn't know exactly what to feel for. He stepped around it like a surgeon examining a patient, tapping gently at sections with a small tuning rod, then pausing to listen. Jeremy watched in awe as his father navigated the space like it was alive, stopping only when he reached a narrow cluster of heat exchangers that had been replaced in recent years with newer alloy components. Monroe pointed there and muttered under his breath, telling Jeremy to mark that down. He continued this process for hours, referencing his notes, asking Jeremy to fetch particular tools, not digital scanners or high-tech diagnostics, but analog devices, resonance meters, heat-sensitive chalk, even a long-forgotten stethoscope designed for listening to pipes and pressure lines. Outside the engine room, the rest of the crew grew restless. Engineers were whispering among themselves, speculating that the old man was wasting time, or worse, potentially compromising the system further. But Kearns held the line. He trusted Monroe, not because of nostalgia or military sentiment, but because deep down he knew that Monroe approached the engine like no one else could, not as a machine, but as a relationship cultivated over decades. Monroe wasn't trying to dominate the system or force it back into submission. He was communing with it, understanding its hesitations, its resistance, its pain. After several more hours, Jeremy handed him a final reading from a mechanical gauge they'd hooked into the left coolant loop. Monroe stared at the numbers, his brow furrowed. Then, like a man solving a riddle he hadn't thought about in years, he nodded quietly and instructed Jeremy to open the intake manifold. They would have to replace a single pressure valve, a tiny, easily overlooked part that had been causing a cascade of malfunctions through the entire system. The part itself wasn't faulty. It was new, state-of-the-art, in fact. But Monroe suspected it wasn't compatible with a feedback circuit buried deep in the control system, something that had never been updated when the rest of the engine was modernized. It wasn't incompetence that had caused the issue. It was misalignment. The modern components and legacy systems weren't speaking the same language. The specialists had been optimizing parts in isolation, not understanding the holistic balance required for a ship this old and this complex. Monroe's solution wasn't just to swap the valve, it was to recalibrate the entire pressure circuit to harmonize with both the analog and digital layers of the engine's personality. Jeremy helped install a modified converter Monroe had designed years ago, an elegant bridge between the ship's mechanical past and its high-tech present. When they were done, Monroe stood back, hands greasy, shirt damp with sweat, and looked at his son. No words were needed. Jeremy understood the magnitude of what they had just done. Monroe walked to the master control panel, slowly flipping the necessary breakers and priming sequences. The lights above the chamber flickered, the hum grew louder, and within moments the engine roared to life. Not violently, not like the over-revved sputtering starts the engineers had been getting for weeks. This was steady, strong, rhythmic. Like a giant heartbeat rediscovered after flatlining for too long. Jeremy's eyes widened, tears brimming at the edges. He had always known his father was brilliant, but watching him revive the soul of a ship no one else could fix hit him with a force he couldn't articulate. Monroe stood still, just listening, letting the sound wash over him like an old song he hadn't heard since his younger days at sea. Outside, alarms signaled a successful start. Engineers burst into cheers. Admiral Kearns, watching from the observation bay, allowed himself a rare smile. He knew what had happened inside that room wasn't just mechanical. It was generational, it was personal, it was art. Captain Ruiz stood motionless in the observation deck as the late afternoon sun streaked across the silent carrier deck, casting long shadows over idle jets and cranes. The vast ship, once a symbol of dominance, still floated, with its massive engine lifeless. Every crew member moved with a stiffness in their shoulders, as if the spirit of the vessel had seeped into their bones, making even small tasks feel weighty. Below, in the depths of the engineering section, the crew hovered around the central console, eyes flicking to the analog meters and digital readings as if hoping the data would change on its own. But the numbers didn't lie. The core turbine remained stalled. Even though power had returned to peripheral systems through auxiliary connections, the heart of the ship still refused to turn over. The breakthrough Elijah had led in isolating the error pathways had given everyone hope, but now they were dangerously close to another wall. After a full night of simulation testing, software analysis, and sensor calibration, the issue had narrowed to one possible culprit: an outdated interlock mechanism buried behind a reinforced bulkhead in engine compartment B5. The part, rarely accessed and never replaced in over a decade, was supposed to be indestructible. Yet, as Elijah and his small team of mechanical specialists opened the compartment, the acrid scent of burned rubber and oxidized metal hit them with unexpected force. Flashlight beams darted across corroded edges, and an unmistakable fracture running along the titanium casing of the component. It shouldn't have failed, but it had. More importantly, the specialists now realized that the fracture had miscommunicated torque thresholds to the governor systems, triggering a cascade of safety shutdowns across the engine sequence. They were no longer just looking at a mystery. They had found the literal broken heart of the ship. But the challenge didn't stop there. The component was a legacy design, crafted by hand during the final phase of the carrier's original build nearly 2 decades ago. There was no spare on board. The blueprints were archived in analog form, stored back at a naval facility across the world. Worse yet, fabricating a new part required both a metallurgist and a master machinist familiar with hand-guided CNC units. Lieutenant Ramos looked at the diagram and shook his head in disbelief. No modern training covered this level of craftsmanship. Even the Navy's engineering cadets were taught digital-first design, not tactile machining of high-temperature titanium alloys. The project couldn't be solved with just knowledge. It needed wisdom, touch, and the kind of memory only someone who had shaped these systems by hand could possess. Ruiz held a briefing that afternoon with Admiral Whitaker and the engineering leads. The Admiral's face was tight, his jaw visibly tense. He'd just come from a video call with the Joint Chiefs. They were under pressure now. International threats rising, diplomatic tensions escalating, and a mission timeline that couldn't shift any further. "We have one shot left," Ruiz said quietly, looking at the men and women who had given everything for the last 3 weeks. "And it's Elijah." No one objected. Elijah had earned their trust, not just with his knowledge, but with his stamina, his grit, and his complete rejection of ego. He had spent more time shoulder to shoulder with the junior technicians than anyone expected. He asked questions with humility. He made everyone feel valuable. Now, with only a digital scan of the broken part and a few partial diagrams from memory, Elijah sat at a workbench in the makeshift machine shop on Deck 2. He stared at the simulation, then at a 30-year-old titanium billet recovered from a storeroom. Beside him was Arturo, the machinist who had first shown Elijah the ropes decades ago. Arturo's hands shook slightly, a side effect of age and old injury, but his eyes still gleamed with certainty. "We don't have a 5-axis mill," Elijah said quietly. "We'll have to cut this by hand." Arturo smirked, lifting a carbide lathe chisel with fingers more comfortable holding metal than pen. "Then we do what we always did," he replied. We listened to the metal. The next 36 hours became a ballet of discipline and devotion. Every slice, every angle, every tension check was performed under the scrutiny of both veterans and rookies alike. Elijah and Arturo didn't just work. They taught, narrating each move as a lesson in patience and tradition. It wasn't just about fixing the part anymore. It was about rebuilding the chain of knowledge lost over time. By day 2, the custom piece emerged from the billet like a sculpture from marble, elegant, symmetrical, precise, down to the micrometer. The final step was the integration. The part had to be press-fitted into the assembly without error. A single misalignment could compromise the entire turbine. As the clock pushed toward midnight, the entire engineering team gathered around the console. Lieutenant Ramos initiated the startup sequence. Lights flickered. Pumps engaged. Diagnostics began to scroll across the monitor. Then, with a low mechanical hum that built into a deep, resonant roar, the main turbine came to life. Vibrations rippled through the floor. Digital meters surged into the green zone. The USS Kennewick's engine was alive again. Cheers erupted, hands slapped backs, and adrenaline flooded through every crew member present. Ruiz allowed himself a rare smile, his eyes landing on Elijah and Arturo, who simply leaned against the wall in quiet satisfaction. In that moment, the ship felt whole again, not just because it moved, but because history and progress had joined hands. Elijah had done more than repair a machine. He had bridged a generational gap, proving that sometimes the future of progress rests in remembering how we began. And as the Kennewick prepared once again to leave port under its own power, the world would never know how close it came to losing one of its greatest assets, nor the quiet heroes who brought it back to life. Harlan's instructions echoed through the cavernous engine room, not as shouts but as calm, resolute statements that somehow cut through the clanging metal and the mechanical noise. His presence had altered the atmosphere entirely. Where there had been frantic motion and anxious energy, there was now a methodical rhythm that seemed to emanate directly from him. Every specialist, from the junior technician to the lead propulsion officer, found themselves unconsciously syncing with the quiet intensity of this man who should have been long retired and forgotten. Even the skeptical among them couldn't deny that something had shifted. Harlan didn't just see machinery. He read it, like a musician reading a score, hearing the rhythm and catching the dissonance where others only heard chaos. But now, he needed results, not poetry. As the dismantling process entered its final stage, Harlan made a choice that shocked everyone. He asked to shut down all secondary systems and halt all parallel diagnostics. He needed silence. Not for his sake, but for the machine's. The request was met with resistance, of course. Shutting down even non-vital systems during an active repair cycle was unheard of aboard a vessel as critical as the USS Monroe. But when General Delaney personally authorized the request, all arguments ceased. For the first time in weeks, the great ship's engine room held its breath. In that silence, Harlan approached the engine casing as though he were greeting an old friend, long thought lost. His hand, still calloused from decades past, traced the outer housing, where a network of sensors and temporary circuits had been placed by the engineers who came before him. One by one, he peeled them away, not with anger or disrespect, but with a sort of reverence, as if he were apologizing to the engine for the indignity of having been misunderstood for so long. Then, with only 2 other mechanics to assist him, young crewmen who had quietly earned his trust over the last 48 hours, Harlan began manually inspecting each component from the innermost chamber outward. He didn't use the standard diagnostics interface. He listened. He tapped. He applied pressure. He observed. To him, the engine was not a checklist or a schematic. It was a living system whose pain had been misdiagnosed. It took nearly 6 hours, and by the end, his jumpsuit was soaked in sweat, and his hands bore the grime of a day's hard labor. But then he found it. A small fracture, nearly invisible, buried deep inside the regenerative intake valve. It was something no sensor would catch, and no program would flag. Not because the tools weren't advanced, but because they had not been designed by people who ever considered the possibility of fatigue at this depth of engineering. It wasn't a critical failure in the traditional sense. In fact, the part hadn't technically failed at all. It had just begun whispering wrong. And no one else had known how to listen. Harlan called for a halt. Then, he asked for a replacement part. Not a new one, but a refurbished model he had personally worked on years ago, stored in the vessel's deep inventory. The inventory team dug through decades of archived parts, and finally unearthed it. Dust-covered, nearly forgotten, yet exactly what he needed. When the part was installed, the energy inside the engine room changed again. This time, it wasn't a shift in silence or focus, it was anticipation. Tension wrapped around every spine like a coiled spring. If this didn't work, there would be no more chances. Delaney knew it. So did Harlan. And so did the engine. The final moment arrived. Harlan gave the nod, and the crew activated the main system. A low hum began, deeper and steadier than it had been in months. It grew, not erratically like before, not lurching and stuttering, but strong, even, confident. Lights blinked to life along the master control board in perfect harmony. Pressure levels stabilized within seconds. Fuel intake synchronized instantly. And then, like a long-lost voice finally remembering its tune, the main turbine roared into life with a sound that brought everyone to stillness. Harlan didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply stood back and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. It wasn't victory he felt. It was reunion. Around him, the crew erupted. Cheers. Laughter. Even a few tears. Delaney, watching from the control balcony, exhaled for the first time in hours. He didn't say a word. He simply saluted. Not because Harlan outranked him, but because he had earned it in the only way that mattered. Not through position, but through presence. That night, the Monroe resumed motion, gradually being prepped to sail again for the first time in weeks. But no one on board forgot who made it happen. Not the AI systems, not the fleet of engineers with dazzling degrees and elite backgrounds, but an old man with scars on his hands, oil in his soul, and a history no diagnostic could replicate. And Harlan? He didn't stick around for the celebrations. While others toasted to restored glory, he stood by the aft deck alone, looking out into the sea, the wind brushing against his face like a familiar whisper. He had done what he came to do, not to prove he was right, but to give the ship its voice back, and that, to him, was more than enough. The moment Isaac stood at the heart of the massive engine chamber, time seemed to stretch and thicken as if the ship itself was holding its breath. He ran his hands slowly over the rust-streaked casing, his fingertips brushing decades of grease, heat, and memory. It wasn't just about wires and turbines to him. This was a living machine, the kind you didn't just fix. You listened to it, respected it, understood it. Behind him, Colonel Ames stood silently, flanked by the engineering team who had finally stopped pretending they weren't curious. They watched Isaac not like he was some relic from the past, but like a man who had been summoned by fate itself. Isaac leaned in, pressed his ear to a panel, then stepped back and tapped it gently. Then again. He closed his eyes. The room was still, except for the distant hum of auxiliary systems. In his mind, he wasn't on the USS Washington anymore. He was 35 again, in the bowels of the USS Missouri, sweat pouring down his back as alarms screamed and power sputtered. There had been no backup then, no room for mistakes. You either found the rhythm of the machine, or the whole operation failed. He turned, finally, and motioned for the head engineer. "This valve here," Isaac said quietly, pointing at a corroded pressure release near the left turbine. "It's not original. It's a later replacement. It's incompatible with the feedback loop this system was designed around. That's why your pressures spike every time you try to restart the flow." The engineer blinked. But that was signed off by 3 contractors. It's in spec. Isaac shook his head. In spec for modern systems, maybe? But not for this design. This system uses a harmonic pulse reset that needs a certain kind of pressure backflow. That valve is dampening it. You're essentially muting the engine's ability to speak to itself. The silence in the room grew heavy. One of the junior techs whispered something under his breath. Colonel Ames stepped forward, his voice calm but sharp. Replace it. Now. Isaac didn't wait to bask in the sudden attention. He was already climbing onto a platform, eyes scanning the old wiring like an artist returning to an unfinished masterpiece. And that line, he added, pointing to a frayed cluster beneath the hydraulic matrix. Rerouted during retrofitting, yes? Whoever did it was thinking efficiency, but they cut out the signal redundancy path. That means the system's been running blind every time it self-checks. That's why your readings are perfect, but the engine stalls anyway. The head engineer, to his credit, nodded slowly, a spark of respect igniting in his eyes. You want to fix it? He asked. Isaac nodded. With your team. I'll guide. You'll learn it like I did. This engine doesn't want someone to impose logic on it. It wants someone to remember how it was meant to breathe. For the next several hours, the room came alive not with chaos, but with purposeful motion. Isaac moved between consoles and panels like a conductor directing a symphony. He spoke quietly, clearly, never once raising his voice, but commanding authority simply through certainty. The engineers, skeptical at first, soon found themselves swept into his rhythm. They were no longer simply fixing an engine. They were restoring a legacy. Every bolt replaced, every cable rerouted, every connection resoldered was done with reverence, and as they worked, Isaac told stories, not just technical anecdotes, but human ones. About the men who had once served on carriers like this, about the long nights where one faulty valve could mean life or death, about the art of listening to a machine's silence as much as its noise. The team listened. They asked questions. They began to understand. Slowly, the room began to shift. Tension gave way to collaboration. Frustration melted into focus. For the first time since the USS Washington had come to a grinding halt, there was hope in the air. By the end of the day, every faulty piece identified by Isaac had been replaced or corrected. The central turbine sat dormant but poised, like a giant holding its breath. Colonel Ames stepped forward. "Ready when you are, Mr. Voss?" Isaac nodded. He turned to the lead technician and motioned to the startup sequence. The man's hands moved with practiced confidence. But now, with a new awareness of what those movements truly meant. Systems lit up in sequence. Lights blinked. Monitors flared. And then, the deep, resonant hum of the engine awakening. A hum that built into a steady pulse. A rhythm, a heartbeat. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in stunned silence. Eyes widened, heads slowly turned to the screens. Pressure, perfect. Torque, perfect. Flow, stable. Temperature, nominal. The USS Washington had come back to life. The hum deepened, rolling through the decks like thunder. The kind of sound that only a massive carrier engine could make when it was truly alive. Isaac stepped back, allowing the moment to wash over everyone. He didn't smile, but there was peace in his eyes. Colonel Ames finally turned to him. "I've seen people fix things before," he said, voice low. "But you didn't just fix this. You reminded it who it was." Isaac nodded, eyes still locked on the now thrumming machinery. Sometimes machines just forget. You give them a reason to remember. Part 13 will continue the aftermath, the emotional impact on the team, and the deeper significance of what Isaac just accomplished. Ready when you are. The silence that settled over the engine room was one of reverence, awe, and a touch of disbelief. Men who had spent years perfecting their craft, who had once stood proud in their uniforms, adorned with patches of distinction, now found themselves quietly observing a retired veteran doing what none of them could. Commander Silas Trent had, in just a few focused hours, unraveled the mystery that had stumped not only the young minds of modern engineers, but also the powerful diagnostics of AI-assisted systems. But as the humming engine steadied into a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, there was no smugness in his posture, no gloating in his tone. There was only calm competence, a kind of internal peace that came from decades of discipline, trial, failure, and redemption. And yet, outside the engine room, a storm of consequence was brewing, one that no one had yet accounted for. General Lancaster, still watching from the upper walkway, didn't clap or smile. He simply nodded, absorbing what had just occurred. His instincts had paid off, but now the weight of that decision bore down on him like the full weight of the Atlantic tide. He turned and left the room, heading straight for the operations center to brief Admiral Clarence Monroe, who had flown in earlier than expected to see progress on the carrier's readiness. As Lancaster explained the events of the last 24 hours, Monroe listened with an expression that was unreadable. The Admiral had built his reputation on protocol, chain of command, and the unbending rules of modern naval conduct. Though he'd once served during the tail end of Silas Trent's active duty, Monroe was known to keep personal emotion far from operational decisions. When Lancaster finished, there was a long pause. Finally, Monroe asked one quiet question. Did he document what he did? Lancaster nodded, producing the rough, handwritten notepad filled with diagrams, flowcharts, and annotations. He documented everything as he worked. Old habits, I suppose. Monroe leafed through the notes in silence. He was a man who preferred screens and digital analysis, but something about the gritty pencil strokes on aged paper seemed to root him in a different kind of truth, one he hadn't visited in decades. "Bring him to the bridge," Monroe finally said, and within minutes, Silas Trent was walking calmly into a room thick with tension and brass. There was no salute exchanged, only a mutual acknowledgement between former warriors who had each sacrificed more than their fair share in service. Monroe didn't waste time. He gestured to the screen, which now displayed not just schematics of the fixed engine, but the results of its performance tests. Higher efficiency, stronger thermal thresholds, and more stable torque regulation than any simulated model had ever achieved. "You fixed it," Monroe said, his tone flat. "But how do we proceed?" Silas answered without fanfare, explaining that his solution wasn't a temporary patch. It was a fundamental rebalancing of the fuel distribution matrix, using physical cues from heat patterns and mechanical vibration that no modern sensor algorithm could catch. He'd learned it years ago, during an assignment on an older diesel-electric hybrid, long before digital overlays replaced human instincts. "This engine wasn't broken in code," he said. "It was misunderstood in context." Monroe said nothing for a moment, then dismissed everyone except Lancaster and Trent. Once alone, he turned to the general and asked the question Lancaster had been dreading. "Do you know what kind of storm this invites?" Lancaster answered with complete honesty. "Yes, sir, but I also know what kind of storm we avoided." Monroe exhaled deeply, then looked at Trent. "The question now is, what do we do with you?" Trent gave a soft shrug. "My job's done. I'm not here to be reinstated, and I'm not looking for a medal." But Monroe wasn't talking about rewards or reinstatement. He was thinking 3 steps ahead, as all commanding officers must. If the media got wind of this, it would be a PR nightmare, an emblem of outdated skills triumphing over millions in defense contracts. Politicians wouldn't appreciate the implication. Defense contractors would bristle at the idea of their engineers being shown up by a man with a toolbox and a memory. Monroe knew the truth mattered, but optics mattered more in the world they served. Yet he also knew something else. Truth like this couldn't be buried without cost. "I want your method documented, archived, and preserved," Monroe said. "Off the record, of course, The Navy won't publicize it, but we'll learn from it." Trent nodded. He expected as much. And just as he turned to leave, Monroe added, "One more thing. If we come across another system that defies explanation, I want to be able to call on you." Trent paused only briefly before replying, "I'll pick up if I can still walk." Back on the deck, news of the engine's revival had spread like wildfire. The crew didn't know the full details, but they knew enough. They saw the carrier come alive. They felt the vibration beneath their boots. And they began, quietly and almost reverently, to whisper the name of the man who had done it. Not out of worship, but out of a newfound respect for a kind of wisdom they'd thought obsolete. Lieutenant Harper, who had once doubted the decision to bring Trent aboard, now watched the older man with quiet admiration. She approached Trent before he disembarked and simply said, "Thank you for teaching us something none of our manuals ever could." Trent gave a small nod, eyes scanning the open sea as the wind tugged at his cap. "The sea always has more to teach," he said. "We just need to remember how to listen." With that, he walked away, not toward accolades or interviews, but toward a quiet bench near the ship's stern, where he could sit and hear the familiar rhythm of a vessel, no longer groaning in distress, but humming with potential. The days that followed were unlike anything the crew aboard the USS Archangel had ever experienced. What was once a tense and near-defeated atmosphere began to shift subtly with every hour that passed. The moment Thomas stepped into engineering, a strange energy had started to ripple through the ranks. Not a miracle, not magic, but the quiet authority of a man who had been there, seen worse, and overcome it all. Word spread quickly that the mysterious old veteran was doing something that none of the highly credentialed experts could. He wasn't throwing out theories or reading numbers off screens. He was listening, touching, sensing the ship as if it were a living creature. The engineers, some of whom had scoffed at the idea of an old man poking around, were now following him closely, scribbling down notes, watching in awe as he pointed to junctions and ducts with unerring precision, identifying subtle issues with fluid flow, mechanical resistance, and heat distribution that had gone undetected for weeks. One moment that particularly stuck out was when a group of techs gathered around the portside turbine housing, puzzled over a rattle that none of the diagnostic systems could explain. Thomas had crouched down, placed one hand on the casing, closed his eyes for a moment, and simply said, "She's got a harmonic imbalance in the third shaft mount. A quarter-inch misalignment, probably from when she was dry-docked. It's small, but it's vibrating through the entire drivetrain." When they opened it up, they found the exact issue he had described. From that point on, no one questioned him. As the days rolled into nights, Thomas worked side by side with the team, never demanding special treatment, never belittling the specialists, even when he corrected them. He was patient, deliberate, and impossibly accurate. He walked the entire engine room more times than anyone could count, often alone, sometimes in complete silence, sometimes humming old Navy hymns under his breath. He didn't need the fancy tablets or computer readouts, though he respected those who did. What Thomas had was deeper, a mechanical intuition that came not just from training, but from decades of service, pain, mistakes, and victories. He had lived through design failures, system collapses, fire hazards, near deaths, and impossible repairs under enemy fire. Every part of that engine room spoke to him in a language only a few people on the planet could truly understand, and he spoke back through his tools, his hands, his eyes. Admiral Keene visited engineering often now, though not to give orders. He came simply to observe, to bear witness to what he had hoped for when he called Thomas out of retirement. There were no more hurried arguments between departments, no more desperate conference calls with headquarters. Instead, there was an eerie kind of harmony. Every man and woman on board now had a common goal, a common belief. That belief had a name: Thomas Hale. One evening, after a particularly long session realigning one of the auxiliary generators, Thomas sat alone on a metal bench just off the engine corridor. A young crewman named Patel approached him hesitantly, clutching a wrench in one hand and a notebook in the other. Patel was one of the sharpest graduates from the Naval Technical Academy, full of theory, quick with code, and proud of his credentials. But he looked different now, humble, tired, and somehow wiser than he had been just 2 weeks ago. He asked Thomas if he could sit. The old veteran simply nodded. They sat in silence for a while before Patel softly said, "I thought I knew what it meant to be an engineer until I saw you work. I was wrong. I was arrogant. You taught me more in these 2 weeks than 4 years at the academy." Thomas gave a tired chuckle and looked ahead, eyes slightly distant. "Books are good, so is data. But there's a difference between reading a ship's heartbeat and feeling it." Patel nodded, and the conversation ended there. No more words were needed. Elsewhere, the results of Thomas's interventions were becoming more apparent. The main turbines, which had barely spun 2 weeks ago, were now humming with increasing stability. Fluid systems were pressurized evenly. The thermal readings were back within nominal ranges. One by one, critical systems returned to operational status, not just patched or bypassed, but restored. There was still a long way to go before full capacity, but for the first time in months, the ship was no longer a floating failure. It was healing. And the Navy brass had taken notice. Reports filtered through the ranks that the Defense Department was stunned by the progress. A ship that had bled millions in failed diagnostics and consultant fees was now responding to the hands of a retired machinist with no fanfare, no grand pronouncements, just results. One late night, as the red lights cast a warm glow across the humming engine bay, Thomas stood alone, staring into the humming turbine chamber. He rested one hand on the railing, as if feeling the heartbeat of the beast beneath his fingertips. There was a sense of finality in his posture, not an end, but an understanding that his role was almost complete. He whispered to himself, too softly for anyone to hear, a short prayer of thanks, not for glory or recognition, but for the chance to do one more job that mattered. The next morning the engines roared to life. The final light of the day bathed the towering structure of the aircraft carrier in gold, its long shadow stretching across the naval yard like a symbol of revival. What once felt like a graveyard of effort, littered with broken protocols and mechanical dead ends, now pulsed with new life. The ship's engine room, once a chamber of confusion and failure, hummed steadily, a rhythmic thrum that echoed like a war drum announcing the return of strength. Technicians who had weeks earlier shuffled between stations with slumped shoulders and hollow expressions now stood straighter, spoke louder, and moved with renewed confidence. At the epicenter of this transformation was not a modern consultant, not a high-ranking official, not even an entire fleet of certified specialists, but one retired Navy veteran named Walt Brannan. After the successful test run, and the subsequent full-power trial voyage into open waters, which concluded without a single hiccup, the Pentagon greenlit the return of the USS Concord to active duty. There was no grand ceremony, no brass bands or news crews, but among those who had worked on her, there was something deeper, a solemn pride. The kind born not from victory in the public eye, but from seeing a hopeless situation pulled back from the brink by grit, memory, and wisdom. The carrier, once docked and silenced, was now preparing to sail again, a floating titan made whole by the mind of one man. For General Harland, watching the carrier move out of the harbor under its own power was something close to spiritual. He stood atop a deck platform, hands behind his back, wind tugging at his coat, as the sun lowered behind the sea. There were moments in a man's career when the abstract machinery of duty became real, when all the rules and systems and rank insignias melted away, leaving behind only one truth: responsibility. He had shouldered it all when no one else had answers. He had turned to a man everyone else overlooked. And now, the gamble had not just paid off, it had rewritten the standard operating procedures for how faith and leadership should function in times of crisis. Walt, meanwhile, had quietly declined any public attention. He refused interviews, sidestepped formal recognition, and deflected every praise with his usual gruff charm. His final day aboard the carrier, after the engine was fully certified, he spent cleaning up his workspace and giving personal handshakes to every young technician who had stood by him during the grueling overhaul. He left each one with a unique piece of advice, some technical, some personal, and told them, simply, that the future of the fleet was in their hands now. He exited the ship with the same duffel bag he had arrived with, his boots scuffing the deck one last time, eyes not misty, but quietly content. There was no parade for him. No salute-lined runway. Just the respectful silence of those who knew what had been done. The brass offered him a retirement package bonus, which he redirected to a scholarship fund for naval engineering students. He refused a consulting role with Lockheed, though the offer came padded with zeros. Instead, he returned to his workshop in Corpus Christi, back to the familiar smell of oil and cedar, and resumed working on antique outboard motors for local fishermen. To those who asked, he would never mention the Concorde or what had happened. Not out of secrecy, but because he didn't see it as remarkable. He saw it as doing what needed to be done. But the ripple of his work continued far beyond him. Naval Command began reviewing archival maintenance protocols, prioritizing preservation of institutional memory, and reinstituting retired veteran consulting liaisons for emergency cases. A task force was even established to gather oral histories from elder Navy engineers to preserve techniques long since left out of manuals. And at the Naval Academy, a special plaque was mounted in a corridor of the mechanical wing. It bore no image, no quote, just a name, W. Brannan, with a simple inscription beneath it. In silence, he solved what the noise could not. General Harland, in one of his final acts before retirement, requested to have Walt's original grease-stained notepad, which held the scribbles that cracked the engine's mystery, preserved in a sealed case at the National Navy Archives. Years later, engineering students would point at the faded paper through the glass, marveling not just at the technical brilliance, but at the idea that intuition still had a place in a world dominated by sensors and software. As for the USS Concorde, it returned to active deployments with distinction. It served in humanitarian missions, joint force training exercises, and even played a key role in disaster relief during a Pacific typhoon. No one on those missions ever knew of the mechanical resurrection that had taken place beneath their feet. No one knew that their ship had once been still, dead, and pronounced unsalvageable. All they knew was that it worked, flawlessly. And perhaps that was the greatest testament to Walt's legacy. Not that people spoke his name, but that his work allowed others to move forward without even knowing how close they had come to losing it all. In the end, the story of the USS Concorde was not just about machinery, nor about leadership, nor even about expertise. It was about memory. About how the past, even when tucked away in a quiet garage by the sea, can return to light the way when modernity runs out of answers. And how, sometimes, one man, carrying nothing but an old wrench and an older instinct, can become the tide that turns everything around. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.